Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be part of this discussion. I'm going to talk to you briefly, give you a little bit of a case study, if you will, of how my community has moved on these issues and how we've come to divest, actually disinvestment for now, but I'll get to that in a minute. But let me start with some context for you, for those of you that are maybe less familiar with Portland's leadership over the years on these issues. First, the bigger picture. We've been inspired here. I have been inspired by others that have been leaders on this. Bill McKibben came to Portland and met with me and my team, and certainly anybody who has, like we have today, listened to Bill passionately and clearly articulate this issue, we get inspired. There's a young woman here in Portland named Mia Reback, who's one of the activists involved in 350 Portland, 350 PDX. And I've talked to her a number of times, including actually calling her from D.C. when I was there for the president's announcement of his energy plan. And she talks about her generation and the fear they have about the future. And frankly, anybody who's a dad, as I am, and who listens to a 25 or 30-year-old young woman speak about the future, you can't help but be moved by that. And then third, one of the most amazing meetings I've ever been in was 60 mayors from around the world, probably a number of us on this call, got invited to the Vatican in July to meet with Pope Francis and the Papal Academy of Sciences about his encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si. And I think probably more people have read or are talking about this papal encyclical than maybe all the other papal encyclicals combined, because it really is amazing to see the impact it's had. But there was kind of a humorous moment in this wonderful discussion where there are these 60 mayors sitting in a group in front of Pope Francis, and he's explicating his thoughts about climate change and human suffering, and he kept referring to you world leaders, you world leaders. And I was sitting next to Ed Lee, the mayor of San Francisco, and near Gregor Robertson from Vancouver, British Columbia, and we were literally turning around, looking backwards in the room like, well, did someone come in? But of course, he meant us. He meant that cities are leading the way on these issues, and he's right, but it was a little bit of a surprise to us as mayors that the Vatican and that the Pope had noticed that. So I guess the onus is on us to act. Here in Portland, we have a political culture that is supportive of environmental policy, and actually where people do expect that there's conformity between our values and then what we actually do in public policy or public expenditure. And people, these organizations, put a lot of pressure on us about that. That's been true for a long time. We've had a long environmental record here, and again, it's really populist. It's driven from the grassroots. We've had land use planning for more than 40 years where we've preserved most of the farmland in our state and organized our development more compactly. We've built a lot of transit. We replaced a waterfront highway with a park. We built the first modern streetcar in the country. We adopted the Kyoto Protocol and green building policies earlier than other cities. And again, that's not necessarily because the folks in City Hall are bright or visionary, but because the folks in the community are pushing us in that direction. So people live here, and in fact, many move here because they want to live a lifestyle that reflects their values, and that goes right down to where the food at their farmer's market comes from, or the fact that they can get to work without using carbon. And people here drive us through these organizations like the ones in this slide in that direction. So there's a very strong populist current in our political culture. People expect to have a say. One more anecdote: a long time ago, before I was involved, the city decided to actually fund the support structure for neighborhood associations. And actually, I came up through that neighborhood association system as a political activist and later as a city commissioner. And long before that point, there was this vote on the city council to decide whether they were going to actually provide funding for neighborhood associations. And the mayor at the time was actually on the losing side of that vote. I think it was 4-1. And he thundered as he voted no, "We're funding the opposition." Yes, apparently so, because he lost the next election, and this populism has really remained in force in the city ever since. So it's a little bit of a case of there go the people, I'd better follow them. And so I certainly try to. Another recent issue here in Portland that really helped focus attention on this issue was that we got an early application from a Canadian energy company called Pembina Pipeline. They wanted to build a propane export terminal here, and they met with me, and I said, you know, what mayors typically say, well, you know, go through our environmental process, and if you meet our standards, you know, we'll get you a permit, and you'll be able to build your project. Well, you know, the problem with that was they might have been able to comply on a technical basis, but on a values basis, this was really sort of the last dinosaur. And what happened is the community really rose up and said, wait a minute, this is just not acceptable. And there was probably the biggest popular backlash against a single development in the history of the city. My phone calls and emails in this office literally ran 1,000 to 1 against this. I think we had over 3,000 calls and letters about this in opposition and 3 in favor. So I've never seen that kind of that wave of concern. And again, it's because not necessarily because there's been a long history of fighting about energy issues here in Portland, but because this was so dissonant with people's values and again how they expect to live themselves here. It's not coming from a place of hypocrisy that I expect to drive my SUV to the shopping mall, but I'll pontificate about the environment. I expect to ride my bicycle to the farmer's market and actually live my values, and therefore something like this was just out of character. And so we ultimately told Pembina, you know, you need to withdraw your application because it's just not going to be acceptable to us as a city. This slide's a little distorted, but at least on my screen, but this is the St. John's Bridge in Portland with Greenpeace activists hanging off of it, because we did have another rather high media moment on these issues when our local shipyard did a repair job on a ship called the Fennica that was going to be used to support Shell's drilling operation in the Arctic. And Greenpeace and a lot of local folks here protested that very strongly. They actually delayed the departure of that ship for a couple of days. We ultimately negotiated a peaceful resolution of all this where no one was hurt and the ship got to go on its way. That didn't necessarily please everybody, but it certainly made the point, again, that people here in Portland are globally aware and that they understand that what we do here locally is connected to that. So again, it was a protest that had an impact. Ultimately, as we all know, Shell has decided to not pursue drilling in the Arctic, which is great news. I actually communicated that to the president when I was at the White House, that I thought that would be a good permit for them to not issue, but as it turned out, they did issue it, and Shell's not going to use it, and that's a great outcome. So again, here's a petition that was presented to me about the Pembina pipeline proposal. It was again just an enormous wave of interest and concern at the community level. And again, this is really congruent with what we've done as a city. We adopted the U.S.'s first city climate action plan in 1993 when I was a brand new city commissioner. We recently adopted energy performance benchmarking for commercial buildings. We're trying to make our policies and our investments actually match our values. So that gets us, of course, to the question of where we put our money. And after I arrived here as mayor in 2013, we started with the support of my colleague, Commissioner Steve Novick, to work on a do not buy list. And then we appointed a socially responsible investment committee, and they've gone through the list of potential investments and added these 200 fossil fuel companies to our do not buy list. And so then we've actually acted on that and applied that policy to all of our investments. So we will not be buying these securities in the future. And that's why so far you would more accurately describe our situation as disinvestment rather than divestment, because we do still own some securities in this sector that are going to need to run out the clock. And one of the reasons for that is that we're a very prudently managed city. So, I think sometimes the critique, at least by more conservative cities in the United States, of the People's Republic of Portland is that, we're just crazy out here and we build light rail and eat local vegetables and sort of live some sort of hair shirt, subsistence existence because our values are so strong we're willing to not live well. Well, actually, the truth is quite the contrary to that, which is we've been building a city that we want to live in and that is actually very livable, but again, we expect to conform our investments and our policies to our values. So we had a very in-depth conversation with our very conservative city treasurer, who's an appointed person, not an elected person. And she, like all her predecessors, is a very good steward of our money. And it's why we've had a Moody's AAA rating for 40 years. There are not very many cities that can say that. I've been in those presentations to Moody's, and we come to that table with credibility. And we have financial policies that make sure that we are actually managing this city financially on a very prudent basis. And so the way to do this for us was to say we're going to stop doing things that are contrary to our values and start investing on that basis going forward, but we're not going to actually do some financial harm to our balance sheet by selling the remaining securities that are in our portfolio before their expiration. So that's the Portland story in a nutshell. There's more to come. We're working on green bonds. We are working on other policies like a fossil fuel export policy. Are we willing to participate in the export of fossil fuels from our city or not? The Pembina incident, as I mentioned, really highlighted the public concern about that, but our city planning and economic policies don't necessarily yet reflect that public value fully. So that work will continue, but again, I want to thank Bill and C40 and the others involved in this movement for putting me as a position and a leader of being able to support the community value that my citizens have and actually turn that into action that I think, once again, will make Portland maybe an early adopter, but we expect that just like with light rail and urban growth boundaries, a lot of other cities will be following our lead. Thank you.